I can't stress it enough when I say I'm a huge fan of the Bioshock franchise. I mean, so what if I know that the best way to kill a Big Daddy is to use the security bullseye plasmid? Or that freezing a turret before you hack it allows the fluid inside to slow down? Right now, the people at Irrational Games are working on their latest installment for the franchise, Bioshock Infinite, and it's easy to see why this is one of the most highly anticipated games of 2012. With only one trailer and 2 gameplay videos released thus far, Irrational Games is more determined than ever to top their previous 2 titles. And trust me when I say that coming up with 15 reasons as to why this game is so popular wasn't as hard as you might think. So, would you kindly sit back and relax as we count down the top 15 reasons why Bioshock Infinite is awesome. Coming in at number 15 is the fact that Bioshock Infinite is a true Bioshock sequel. Look, don't get me wrong, I like Bioshock 2. I like the addition of the Big Sisters, and I like the fact that you get to play as a Big Daddy. But if there is one chief complaint among fans and naysayers alike, it's that both games were too similar in experience simply because it was set in Rapture. As a result, players adopted a kind of been-there-done-that mentality. Thankfully, Bioshock Infinite brings us an entirely new setting in an entirely new time period, with a look and feel that's a complete contrast to the previous 2 titles. In my opinion, this is the true sequel to what Bioshock 2 should have been, and the expectations for this game are high. Let's just hope Irrational Games can deliver on their promises. Now, coming in at reason number 14 is Columbia. Now, I simply can't go further in this preview without discussing the game's main setting. The game takes place in the early 20th century, about 50 years or so before the first Bioshock game. And what we know is that Columbia was launched in 1900 by the American government as this massive floating city, and it was meant to symbolize ideas of exceptionalism and manifest destiny. However, it was soon discovered that the city was actually a well-armed battleship, and due to an international incident involving firing upon a group of Chinese civilians during the Boxer Revolution, the city was lost and eventually disavowed by the American government. One of the things I've always loved about Bioshock is its world building. Every little detail is taken into account, and each game feels like a fully lived-in city. And while I find it a bit implausible that civilians would leave first-hand accounts of Rapture's destruction strewn about the city, more often than not the writers and developers at Irrational Games follow the first rule of good storytelling: show and don't tell. Now, similar to the previous reason number 13 is the fact that not only is the game's main setting Columbia, but just the fact that it isn't Rapture. I'm speaking, of course, of the game's overall tone and atmosphere. When you were inside Rapture, everything was dark and grim and claustrophobic. The threat of drowning was ever present, and the constant sounds of metal straining and water dripping made you sure you didn't forget this. Now compare this to the city of Columbia, where everything is bright and vibrant and colorful. Instead of having too little space to walk around in, there is literally a boundless expanse for the player to move. Each game is a literal contrast to one another. One takes place deep within the ocean, the other takes place high above the clouds, and the only real threat other than being shot is falling to your death. Now, reason number 12 is steampunk and alternate history. Now, this is the biggest personal reason on this list, and that's simply because I'm a huge science fiction nerd, so I'm going to include it. This game deals with 2 very specific subgenres of science fiction: steampunk and alternate history. Now, the alternate history aspect of the game is pretty self-evident. There simply was no giant floating city named Columbia that was launched at the turn of the century. But for those of you who aren't familiar with steampunk culture and literature, both deal heavily with technology from the British Victorian era. Imagine fully realized worlds where steam-powered technology is still widely used. Imagine Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, and you'll begin to get the picture. Bioshock Infinite easily fits the bill for steampunk, from the old-style weaponry to the clickety-clank of the SKYLINE system. So for those of you who are in the know, get ready to soak in all that steampunk goodness. Now, coming in at reason number 11 is no VITA-CHAMBERS, at least from the footage we've seen. Now, when it comes to the Bioshock franchise, you either fall into one of 2 camps. You either love the game or you hate the game, and for those that hate the game, the biggest complaint is that there are simply no consequences for dying. Get killed by a Big Daddy? VITA-CHAMBER. Get killed by a Splicer? VITA-CHAMBER. And it really begs the question, What happens when the splicer dies, and why don't they resurrect in the VITA-CHAMBERS as well? I mean, what makes you so special? Now truthfully, I don't know if VITA-CHAMBERS will be in the game, but judging from the footage we've seen so far, that doesn't seem to be the case. And I hope for the sake of Bioshock Infinite it stays that way. Now rounding off the list at number 10 is its morality system. One of the best aspects of the original Bioshock was whether or not you chose to harvest or rescue the little sisters once you destroyed a Big Daddy. However, I feel the real decision making for the player came from whether or not you wanted to battle the Big Daddy at all. In any case, throughout the newest E3 video, we see various instances of moral choices that may or may not affect gameplay. The first instance comes early on in the video when you decide not to euthanize a horse at Elizabeth's insistence. Now not too long after that, you see a post officer about to be executed by a gang of Vox Populi, to which your pleading stops the execution and you become the main target instead.
I didn't do any of this! Hey! It's just a postman, he didn't hurt anybody. It's DeWitt! It's DeWitt! Get him!
It's clear that the developers have put a lot of effort into crafting its morality system for Bioshock Infinite, hopefully with possible branching storylines and increased replayability as a result. Now reason number 9 is Vigors and Nostrums, which have effectively replaced plasmids and tonics from the first two games. According to recent interviews, Vigors are activated powers such as telekinesis, electricity, and animal control, as seen through the manipulation of crows in an early E3 gameplay demo, while Nostrums are more passive abilities that grant a player increased strength or damage resistance. Unlike the original Bioshock, in which players can activate a gene bank to change their plasmids and tonics at will, Vigors and Nostrums are permanent and cannot be changed later in the game. Each container of Vigor has a limited number of charges within it, and while you can find more throughout the game's environment, you can only carry a certain number of them into battle, while Nostrums are permanent changes to the player's character and cannot be changed later in the game. Now ranking it at number 8 is the characters that make up Bioshock Infinite, and what better way to start out than with the character of Elizabeth. For starters, you play Booker DeWitt, a former Pinkerton agent whose sole mission is to escort Elizabeth safely off of Columbia, who's been imprisoned there for the past 12 years of her life. Now, we don't know much about her character other than she is a woman of some significant importance. From early gameplay footage, we know that Elizabeth has some type of telekinetic ability that drains her energy whenever it's used. However, one of the chief concerns among fans was that the game would just be one giant escort mission. However, that doesn't seem to be the case, and when creative director of Bioshock Infinite Ken Levine was asked, "What happens if Elizabeth is killed?" he simply answered, "It's in the simulation." Now, coming in at reason number 7 is the tears that Elizabeth is able to control. Now, in the most recent gameplay footage, Elizabeth is seen over a dying horse as she rips open the fabric of space-time in order to save its life. Needless to say, audiences were floored when she opens up a tear into an alternate 1983 where a nearby marquee says Revenge of the Jedi, which was the original title for the Return of the Jedi for those not in the know. Throughout the demo, viewers witnessed shimmering tears in the fabric of reality, which Elizabeth could then bring into the real world and aid them during combat. However, there are limitations to these powers, as in one of the gameplay videos she's heard as saying, "It's too soon. I can't control it." However, I can't wait to see how this plays during gameplay. Now, reason number 6 is the emergent gameplay that's set to take place in Bioshock Infinite. Now, with the first two titles, I like to think that there were 4 major systems at work. You had the splicers, you had the Big Daddies, you had the various turrets and camera systems set out throughout Rapture, and you also had yourself. Now, one of my favorite aspects of gaming was seeing how each of these systems interacted with one another. I mean, it wasn't uncommon to stumble into a new area and see a Big Daddy attacking a splicer, or a turret shooting down a splicer. Add a couple of plasmids to the mix, and you've got a recipe for the unexpected. The truth is, I really have no idea how these systems will interact with one another. Heck, I don't even know what these systems will be in Bioshock Infinite, and it's simply whetting my appetite for more. Now, reason number 5 is the Handymen. In the first trailer for Bioshock Infinite, players are presented with the cityscape of Rapture, and many thought this would be the setting for the next game. However, it quickly becomes apparent that these are simply models in a fish tank, and the player is thrown back, revealing a robot-like monster known as the Handymen. While similar in size and shape to the Big Daddy, The handymen are highly mechanized and have a chambered heart deep within their chest encased in glass. Now I can't talk about this simply because I don't know how the handymen will be featured during gameplay, or what role they'll have other than they're going to be constantly pursuing Elizabeth. I guess it's just another case of only time will tell. Now leading off the list is reason number 4, and that's Zeppelins. Now this is again one of the weaker reasons on this list, but in my opinion no steampunk epic would be complete without Zeppelins. Now when I put this reason on this list, I'm not just speaking about Zeppelins, but rather referencing in general to any flying vehicle that may or may not be in Bioshock Infinite. When looking at footage of Booker DeWitt walking through the streets of Columbia, it's easy to forget that you're in a city high above the clouds. So really, who's to say that you won't encounter a myriad of vehicles on your way to escaping the city with Elizabeth? Personally, I can't wait to see what they do with these minor changes in gameplay. Now coming in at number 3 is the Vox Populi, which is Latin for voice of the people. Basically, tensions have arisen between the rich upperclassmen and the lower immigrant class that demands equality, known as the Vox Populi. Fighting has broken out between these two factions and has escalated to full-on civil war, basically turning the utopian vision of Columbia into the dystopian reality that players will experience. One of the things I find fascinating about Bioshock Infinite is, as opposed to the first 2 titles where you're fighting splicers that are hopped up on Adam and Eve, you'll be fighting radicals hell-bent on revolution. Now there's really no telling how your character will play in the larger events of the game, but it'll be interesting to see how the story develops. Now reason number 2 is the SKYLINE, which is a rail-based system used to deliver goods and people throughout Columbia. Your character is equipped with a grappling hook that's capable of transporting him from one district of Columbia very quickly to another. Creative director Ken Levine has gone on record with saying that this has been one of the hardest experiences to recreate in-game, and the people at Irrational Games have been doing their best to make this a relatively seamless experience. If you're at all like me, you're petrified of heights, and developers have likened using the SKYLINE system to being on a roller coaster. In fact, one article in Kotaku said that it is like being on a literal on-rails shooter. Now it's unclear whether you'll be able to simultaneously use weapons while riding the SKYLINE system, other than simple melee weapons, but it's quickly apparent that jumping from one rail to another is a fluid and accessible experience and the best that the developers hope to achieve. Now capping off this list is the SONGBIRD. Now, from watching the first gameplay footage, it's quickly apparent that Elizabeth is running from something, and judging by the first trailer, it's assumed that she's running from a Big Daddy. But then this happens.
That was the one who was chasing you, right?
No, that wasn't him. That wasn't him. That's him!
I nearly shit my pants when I saw this footage, and it just goes to show you how Irrational Games manages to top itself again and again. Basically, the SONGBIRD is a giant mechanized eagle that's been in charge of protecting Elizabeth over the past 12 years, and when you decide to intervene, boy does it get pissed. Its squawk is menacing, its size gargantuan, and the fact that it could swoop in at a moment's notice makes it that much more unpredictable. As always, I'm the Millennium Gamer, signing off.
Believe it